Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Hiroki. This talk is about development of mathematical models to explain how the social disagreements may get intensified spontaneously based on some self-organizing dynamics. So this was about the recently published paper in PRE back in July. And you can download the whole material from this link. It's open access. So the basic motivation and the phenomenon we want to model and understand is how the disagreement between the people in the society can get widened spontaneously based on the interactions. So here are some examples, such as the political disagreement in the US between two parties, or defend or defund the police. That kind of the argument also in the United States, and also already getting classic, but in the UK, there was a Brexit stuff that took place several years ago. So to understand these expanding disagreement, the typical way of explaining those would be to attribute the cause to the certain kind of events or triggers or individuals, groups, to blame them because of them. This happened or that happened. But in this the study, we want to avoid attributing the causes of the growing disagreement to certain external events, but instead, can we attribute the main mechanisms of such self-organization of disagreement into some internal information sharing behavior of people? So in that case, we are trying to understand this process as a spontaneous pattern formation process, self-organization process of complex systems. So in particular, in this specific mathematical modeling work, we want to pay attention to the enhanced information gathering ability that the people have gained over the last several decades, like smartphones and the social media and the expanded computational abilities. People have more access to the wider variety of information. And how can this affect the advancement of technology by itself could explain, at least partially, the growing disagreement. So main research objective is to develop the partial differential equation-based model of opinion dynamics process. In this case, we use a lot of mathematical biology, population dynamics type of ideas to develop a model. The model itself is very simple. And one mathematical technical novelty is to use non-local gradient. Instead of just assuming that people have the access to the local gradient of the popularity of opinions, we define the non-local interaction kernel, and then the shape and the width of the kernel is being used as a model of the people's information gathering ability. And we did both the analytical and the numerical the studies to find out the conditions in which the spontaneous pattern formation happened. And then we also measured the characteristic distance between the opinionated groups and how that distance actually changes as you change the shape and the size of the interaction kernel. So that's the main objective. Here's a model. A model is very simple. It's a transport equation with diffusion terms and the non-diffusion based more active aggregation process. The first term is the diffusion term, and the second term is the chemotactic behavior. So population actually moves toward the higher peak of the perceived population density. So this is the opinion space. For simplicity, we assume the one-dimensional continuous finite line segment as opinion space. And the population density is represented as a function P of X and T. And the assumption here is that the people are more like a homophilic individuals. So they want to move their opinions more toward the popular ideas. So they want to assimilate local neighbors. So in this case, we use this non-local interaction kernel, this sine wave-ish curve. So you calculate the cross correlation between the population distribution and the local perception kernel. In this case, it's negatively correlated, so value is going to be negative. Therefore, individuals standing on top of this point will tend to move toward the left, which naturally follows the slope of the population density at the local scale. So the peaks get higher, valleys get lower. So that's the highly unstable dynamical process. And this one, as I mentioned, this model uses non-local interaction kernel. The kernel is defined here, lowercase g, and this is the cross correlation between the population density P and the local interaction kernel G. So kernel is defined as a combination of two Gaussian curves, one on the right for the positive side, another on the negative side for negative the amplitude. So this is the exact shape. And by changing the distance between those two peaks and also the width of each of the Gaussian kernel, we can change several different scenarios like this, as pictured in this slide. So as you decrease the distance mu and the standard deviation sigma toward 0, we can mathematically prove that this actually converges to original local gradient. And as you keep increasing the sigma and the mu to the larger value, you represent the situation where people have access to the wider variety of information. So the main objective is what's going to happen if you change the sigma and the mu. So here's one demonstration. So as you start the simulation from the locally, globally homogeneous yet with minor perturbation added state, you eventually see this kind of self-organization process. And this is fairly commonly known in mathematical biology. It's an auto-aggregation process. The peaks get higher and the valleys get lower and eventually reaches population 0. And you see these distinct population sites. So in this case, you can measure the characteristic distance between peaks, and that gives you the quantitative idea how much disagreement exists between opinionated populations. And here's more a spatial temporal visualization of the same results. It's a space-time visualization. Horizontal axis is space, opinion space. Vertical axis is time, flowing from bottom to the top. You see at a certain point in time, the spontaneous pattern formation gets established. And once you see the opinionated population here and there, they are fairly stable. Sometimes you see the merger between opinions here. And this is fairly generic pattern formation process in this model. And we conducted the linear stability analysis. What kind of wavelength would be able to destabilize homogeneous solutions. So without all the mathematical details skipped, you can take a look at the original paper. So here's the final conclusion of linear stability analysis. And then you can show that if this big quantity is positive for a certain spatial frequency omega, the homogeneous population density distribution is unstable. And we can rewrite a little bit so that by defining this function as a q of omega, you can show that if the people's tendency to move toward the locally more popular population, that's the parameter c, and the population density p of h is greater than diffusion terms, diffusion constant, then the pattern formation happens. So this is fairly consistent with any other mathematical biology type of models. So the main question here then is, what would be the effect of this interaction kernel to satisfy this inequality, to destabilize the process? So we did a numerical calculation of this quantity q of omega for different value omega and mu and sigma. So simply put, as this mu and sigma becomes larger, which means that the people gain more and more information from a wider source of opinions, the characteristic spatial frequency omega gets smaller, which means that the distance between peaks gets larger, longer. So therefore, this qualitatively shows that as people have access to the wider opinion space, then the people's disagreement actually gets much, much bigger. So here's a numerical simulation that shows the actual patterns as you increase sigma, standard deviation of Gaussian kernel, and mu, the distance between two different Gaussian kernels. As you can easily see, greater values of sigma and mu tend to create a more and more distant, much larger population spots in the space. And here's yet another visualization, the summary of all the numerical solutions and analytical calculation together. So blue dots are numerical simulations and showing that specific value of mu and sigma and the characteristic distance between peaks in the opinion space.
And all the numerical simulations are always above the analytically predicted lower bound. So this guarantees that as you increase the parameters mu and sigma, the population peaks needs to get farther away. So this confirms our initial hypothesis that people's information gathering ability may actually contribute to the more disagreeing opinions. So we can use, in the last 1 minute, we can also run some scenario simulation. So this is a simulation with temporally increasing value of sigma and mu. So you can set up the initial condition like this. Initially, you have some opinion groups already established. And as you keep increasing sigma and mu during the simulation, this happens. So this would be the interesting illustration of what might have happened over the last 5 decades in the human society. As people get more and more access to the faster computation and more efficient information gathering ability, opinions get merged, and eventually you have a very extremely disagreeing the major opinion groups. This is a very suggestive to what's happening maybe. And also we also tested another scenario. Can we stop that kind of trend by suppressing social media, for example? So this is another simulation that changes the value of sigma and the mu in the middle of the simulation. And turns out you cannot reverse the directions. Once the opinion groups are established, even reducing the sigma and mu does not really reduce the disagreement. So instead, they get crystallized. So this gives us another challenge. What else can we do to diffuse those opinionated groups? So this is not a simple question to answer. Anyway, so that's it. So conclusion is this study illustrated how the increasing ability of information gathering might contribute to the widening disagreement in our society. And the external intervention we tested at the very end may not help relieving that kind of conflicts. So one main paradox here is that our models show that the more information people have access to, the more severe their disagreement they can get. So this is quite counterintuitive. So we want to thank our funding agency, JSP Skakenhi, and the Max Planck Institute in Germany. Thank you very much. This is the picture I took from the Dresden when I worked on this project. Thank you very much.